Great. I'll be honest, I wasn't quite sure how to start this off, but one of the things that I quite often feel in my role is the blinkers are on a little bit, and I'm always intrigued to find out a bit about how other people are going about things and doing things. So I thought, what better than to kind of flip that on its head and just go through a couple of little things that I find useful and we find useful where I work. So Power BI goes dating. I was going to really labour a lot of the date puns, but I thought I'm going to have to draw a line somewhere. I'll be honest, I tried that on my wife last night and she just put her head in hands. So hopefully there's a better reaction here. Anyway, just quickly, a little bit about me. So I am Business Intelligence Manager at Marston's. If you don't know Marston's, we're a pub company, one of the largest in the UK, around 1,350 venues across the country. There's two local ones. So you've got Picture and Piano down by the canal, and there's also Lost and Found at the top of Bennett's Hill. But they're not really kind of our normal venues. Most of our pubs are kind of community and housing estates and stuff like that. Been Business Intelligence Manager for about 4 years. Actually started at Marsden 12 years ago. It's kind of the only place I've ever worked, hence the blinkers being on a little bit. And started as a finance apprentice. We were right, yes. And then somehow ended up doing data and reporting and stuff like that. There are quite a few synergies into accounts, to be fair, but yeah, bit of a strange one. Been working with Power BI for about 9 years, so quite close to when it first came out. Seen it change a lot over the years. I'm a bit of a SQL geek. Within the team at Marston's, we look after the kind of end-to-end process. So right from data ingestion, transformation, warehousing, and then all the way through to reporting, naturally, with a lot of SQL within that. And then a slightly personal one, I've got a bit of a weird obsession with cars and automotive, but we'll skip past that. So on to the meat of the topic. So there's two kind of common problems that me and my team and the rest of it have kind of come across when it comes to working with dates in Power BI. The first one is what I've kind of labelled here as report pre-filtering. So quite often the scenario is we produce a report that might have a time period on it that could be the previous week of data, previous complete week of data or something like that. And the trouble is, if you publish that report with a specific week selected, as soon as the next week comes around, that filters out of date and is kind of useless. So the solution is to try and find a way to have filters that update themselves, which I will come on to in a second. The second one is comparing financial periods in DAX. So anyone that's worked with a financial calendar will probably know it's pretty certain it won't line up with a proper calendar. And that often renders a lot of the kind of built-in DAX time intelligence functions fairly useless. So there's a method that we use quite a lot to make it a lot easier to kind of hop around a financial calendar and compare different periods of time and things like that. So those are the two problems. And I'm hoping that these are sort of things that you guys might have come across as well. So the solutions. The solution one for predefined date filters is actually to have a second date table. So anyone that uses Power BI a lot will know that it loves a star schema. It's almost certain that you'll have a date dimension table. And what we do is we create a second date table off the back of that, which I'll explain a little bit more now. So this second date table will effectively have one row per day of every predefined time period that you want to use. So for example, if I use the example of last week, for us, a bit weirdly, our week ends on a Saturday. So last week would be the end on the 29th, start on the 23rd. And this table would have one row for every day of that week. And next to it would be labeled as last week. And then you'd have several of these, one for maybe the last 13 weeks, the last 40 weeks, whatever time period you might want. Obviously, that's going to need to be repopulated and rebuilt on a regular basis because last week changes. Ideally, we'd do it daily, depending on what sort of time periods you want to have predefined. And then from there, what we do is we create a bidirectional relationship back to your existing traditional date table. And while that might not be the easiest to comprehend, I will now jump into a little demo to show what that looks like. So don't judge the design here. It's not the point of the report. Here's a little example of what I mean. So we've got a week ending date selected here. So for us, it's previous Saturday. And I can come in here and say we moved on a week. I'd have to scroll down, choose the next week, and move the report along. Of course, people could forget to do that. They might miss the fact that they've got a different week selected, etc. So when we've implemented this second date table, what it allows us to do is have another slicer which has a set of time periods in it where we can do things like just choose the last week, or take that potentially a bit further and choose the last week from the last year or something like that. And because this will always keep itself up to date, we can publish the report with this as a default filter. And every time that report gets opened by a user, they know that they're looking at the period of time that's selected. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, behind the scenes in the data model, we have a fact table as we normally would, a dimension for pub in this instance, dimension for day. And this is what I mean about this extra table that sits over here. So of course, on this side of the relationship, we've got the many side because this date will repeat itself. And over here, we've got the one side. And normally in Power BI, of course, the relationship wants to flow from the one side to the many side. And this is why we need a bidirectional relationship, because we want to filter this table and that filter to be passed over to here and then in turn over to our fact table. If I then go into the data view for this, so if I was to select last week, this is what I mean about having one row per day for last week. And if I flip this on its head a little bit and go and choose last Saturday's date, and then knock the filter off for the time period, what we'll see is that date exists against several of the time period selections, hence why you need this bidirectional relationship. So that is kind of the answer to that problem, and that's worked really, really nicely for a lot of our reports, having that default filter. I will move on to problem 2 and solution 2. Before I do, has anyone got any little questions or anything? If not, I will move swiftly across. So back over to PowerPoint for a sec. The second problem, as I mentioned earlier, was around working with financial calendars, and in particular being able to kind of compare different time periods in a financial calendar and that sort of thing. So the solution we've found to this that works really effectively is to, for every key date field or key financial calendar field, create an index. And what we try and achieve is for each item, so financial year, financial period, financial week, whatever time periods we want, we create an index where 0 always represents where we are right now. So we can always work out where our current position is. And then for every item that goes backwards, we'd increment down by 1, so get to a -1. And for every item forwards, we'd go up by 1. So for the example of a week, I mentioned last week earlier, last week would be -1, current week would be 0, etc. And this means you always know where you are. And if you want to compare a couple of different periods, you can just offset by that index. You've not got to jump through a load of DAX hoops to try and break apart the text that you might have for your financial period or financial year and then offset and all the rest of it. You can just rely on your index. So quick little demo on this one. So over to the other page. So this page is quite similar to the other one. We've got net sales by time over here. By the way, all these numbers are fictional. They might look real. Hub names are real, but the numbers are made up. I've got the time period selected here for MAT period. If you've not heard of MAT before, it stands for moving annual turnover. So effectively, always going to have 12 months of data. And what this means is here's our most recent period and here's the 11 prior to it. While that's really useful, what we might want to do is bring through the equivalent data for the prior year. And as I say, if we were to do that in DAX without these indexes, we'd have to break apart the text that we've got here for the period, split it into its component parts, offset the year, glue it back together, and then apply a filter, which, while is perfectly possible, has got a bit of overhead from a performance point of view and is more complicated DAX than it needs to be. So if I quickly go and drag in another measure, got a measure here that represents the sales for the period last year, and that drops in quite nicely and works in a dynamic fashion. So if I was to go and choose a different period or a couple of different periods, or take off this MAT period filter and go and choose some other point in time, as long as the data's there, it will always give me the period of time for the prior year. So what's going on in that DAX? Let me find the right icon. So what we've got in here is, first of all, we define a little variable. Yes. Thank you, Jake. First of all, we define a little variable, and that is just getting the max of the period index. And I'll come on and show the indexes in a second. So effectively, it's going to be looking at 2025-04 and then grabbing the index that relates to that period. Then what it's going to do is just check whether the period index is blank or not, because otherwise we remove our row context. If it's not, it jumps into a calculate. It's going to calculate net sales. It will remove the filters we've got on our date tables, and then it will reapply a filter based on that index, but offset by 12 to go and get us the equivalent for last year. And as I say, that works really nicely in a dynamic fashion, and far easier than trying to split the periods apart and jump through lots of DAX hoops. And that's pretty much it in terms of the actual solution. Just quickly in terms of what the indexes look like, hopefully we can visualize it fairly easily. But this is an example of the financial calendar, or the date table that we've got in here. If I scroll all the way down and try and find where today is, which is going to be somewhere around here, we should see, there we go. So we've got a week index over here, and we've got zeros against the current week. We've got a year index, which is of course 0 for lots and lots of rows, and a period index somewhere. Where's it gone? There. And as we can see, it goes to negatives when we go back in time, and then positives when we go forward in time. And we can just rely on those columns to hop about our financial calendar. I don't know what time I'm on. I do have, if we want, a little example in SQL of how we can actually achieve this and build this stuff. But yeah, I don't know how much time I've used up. A couple of minutes. Okay. So yeah, I don't know how much SQL everybody knows, but very quickly, to achieve the indexes, thanks, Jake. To achieve the indexes, we've effectively got a demo of a little financial calendar here with the sort of things we'd normally expect. What I'm then doing is doing a rank over the time periods that I want to apply this index to, which gives us effectively the oldest period of time is rank 1, and then it increments all the way up. What we've then got to do is just create that little change so that 0 becomes where we are right now. So a bit further down, what I'm effectively doing is grabbing whatever the rank is where the date is today for each item, and then up here, just taking one off the other to make sure that wherever we are right now is 0. So that's how we achieve the indexes. What you can then actually do from a SQL point of view is use the indexes to create the other table, the filtering table. So in here, and this is a bit ugly to be honest, there's much better ways of doing it, but it's a simple way to display it. A load of unions, which means we basically stack a load of queries on top of each other. And all I'm doing is selecting 2 columns. The first one is kind of hard coded. The second one is the date. And then I'm just using the indexes to grab the appropriate period of time. So I know current week is always going to be index 0. The current week for last year is going to be negative 52, and so on and so forth. And then if we want to do a range, we can do it between, etc. And then what that kicks us out is this right here. which again, can't zoom in on that bit, unfortunately. It's not ordered, but that's what it gives us, and we can throw that straight into Power BI, and away we go as demonstrated. That's pretty much all I've got, to be honest. Hopefully I've not run over time and we're about right.